Hello, everybody. Hello to you personally, because it's very unlikely, given the size of the modest size of my audience, that any two people would be listening to the recording such that the timing of the recording would match for each of them in their time, space, location. It is possible, and it's probably a bit more likely than I imagine. So, hello, listener. Hello to you, where you are while you're listening. Welcome. It's a gusty Sunday afternoon here in the city named after Francis of Assisi, I suspect, who was well known as a friend and companion to the organisms, the animals, the plants, probably the insects. I always find it strange when a person professes biophilia, the adoration of living beings, but or of organismal living beings, but somehow excludes the insects, who are in a way staggeringly older than most animal species. If we look at time as a function of population and the generational iterative pulse, right? If I ask questions If I ask questions about the number of generations of turtles, first of all, these questions are going to be foundationally unanswerable. What we're going to get are approximations based on data, and there's lots of data we don't have as a species, or even that it's not possible by any ordinary empirical means to produce, to get. So I ask questions about, for example, generations of elephants, relatively long-lived species, not entirely dissimilar to humans in terms of their longevity, and I'm not sure what their generative cycles are like. In other words, for example, given a group of 100 elephants, how many new elephants per year do you get, and so forth. There's also a problem that I don't think there's a mathematical solution for, although there are functional solutions. There's a problem where, obviously, if you go back in time for population dynamics, the number of progenitors appears to exponentially, I think it's exponentially, I could be wrong about that, grow larger. So that it looks like and the number of ancestors of a currently extant organism become infinite as you go backwards. There's some technique by which we reduce that number. I cannot recall it at the moment. It has to do with an analysis. So one thing it has to do with is subtracting ancestors for multiple children, I think. But I'm not an expert on this. The problem has long bothered me because in trying to determine, in trying to get a hold of a number that resembles something like biological time. Since each distinct organism is a unique participant in the temporal manifold, undergoing locally unique changes, generating unique ancestors, affecting other creatures and situations uniquely, and also being affected this way, it turns out that biological time is very strange stuff. One could understand it as a form of compression or exponentiation. My point, though, before I get to birdwalky here early in the conversation, is that the number of fruit flies that have existed, for example, must catastrophically dwarf the number of elephants that have existed. So if, in order to understand biorelational time, we count the number of fruit flies per minute, per second, per year, in which fruit fly time, quote unquote, is passing. Right? The mode of time that fruit flies biorelationally comprise, the mode of time that elephants comprise, we discover that the fruit flies are in fact vastly older than the flat age of the universe. Vastly, like probably many factors of the age. And if we're concerned with something resembling evolutionary change or the development and mutation of genome sets, this is the kind of time we need to be thinking about. Of course, humans often have pretty much the dumbest reasons for considering these matters. No sweat.
We're not going to be using
So the insects are ancient beyond imagining. Especially as if we, clayed them up and say like, well, we're going to talk about all the insects, all the different forms of them, including the stuff we don't usually think, taxonomically we might think of as different. For example, centipedes, scorpions, spiders. These are not true insects, quote unquote, according to our taxonomies. But we would collect those all together. I promise you the age is probably billions of trillions of life years in those creatures, so ignoring them. And also, without them, there are no animals, right? So you have a direct link to origin in relationships that are really important. It's funny, what was the ways of knowing. Okay. And what was I thinking about? It's weird. My mind has traveled since I began this recording in such a fashion that for the moment I cannot locate the thread that it was my intention. Okay, wait, now I see. Ah, yeah. Okay, so now I think I have recovered the original thread. So the humans have what we might call ways of knowing. And these are specific branches on the tree of knowledge. And I'm not necessarily speaking of the one referenced in Genesis. though at the same time, perhaps I am a bit. And lots of these ways are abstract. Some of them are not particularly abstract. For example, biology, pretty abstract. History, very abstract. The broad array of sciences, mostly abstract. Philosophy, psychology, social studies, mathematics, mechanics. These are branches on the tree. Presuming that there's a single tree we're talking about. But then you have things like dance, traditional knowledge, ceremony, ritual, religion. These are also ways of knowing. And then things get a little stranger because there are orders on the tree. So for example, there is the order of representational cognition, which will include nearly all of most of the branches. Just check a couple things here. Okay, that seems to be working. So, some of these topics, particularly philosophy and psychology, and to some degree biology, though we might find out that many of the branches intersect beyond their superficial layer, like beneath their superficial layer, they intersect. At the superficial layer, they're highly representational, which means they're conceptual and linguistic and taxonomic and abstract and model fraught, right? They're filled with models. Beneath that, something stranger and more interesting starts to happen. So, for example, obviously, psychology, for example, gives us models and perspectives on our interiority and on what we might refer to as the psyche, which is obviously the first part of the name of the discipline. Similarly, psychiatry. These start to explore.
Yeah, I don't check it all the time. I used to check it a few times a day.
The confusing and often nonsensical. In other words, certainly not merely rational. Aspects of our interiority. It's not clear to me what animals and insects experience, though I do believe it's possible to directly share in that experience. It's certainly possible to relationally share in that experience. But by directly, I mean the employment of a faculty in human beings that allows us to participate in the interiority of other beings, not merely model it. Yeah. We know that humans can have theory of mind and things like this, talking about something much different. A faculty science would, modern science would almost unanimously disavow. A faculty which theory of mind is probably the remnant of. In terms of understanding human interiority, modern science perhaps has a grasp on 1 to 7% of the terrain at best. We're talking about an array of layered infinities, similar to the universe. And the lens with which you approach it will radically delimit what you can see or understand or become aware of. And humans, moderns particularly, especially at the clade level or cohort level, right, where science is done, they tend to use singular lenses, which is ridiculous, right? Like a primary or singular purposive orientation. And that purposive orientation is often deconstructive, right? Tears things apart. And it's weird. Humans are weird. They often do things that are completely inexplicable. Deconstructive and utilitarian, right? What's the function? And then also extractive. What can we get, do, own, dominate, given some understanding of something we're observing. These perspectives mostly make us dumber, continue over time to evict us from a relation and participation with life and its origins, and produce monumental libraries of abstract knowledge mechanism and the results of the inaction of those things, which are generally omnicidal. Right? They obliterate life and its bases. And they're omnicidal precisely because they're disembodied and disembodying. So at the superficial layer of the tree of human knowledge, you have these abstract forms that I enumerated previously. And then underneath them you start to get stuff that deals with you start to get stuff that's fairly that at least might be metacognitive. Right? It can examine cognition, linguistics, psycholinguistics, traditions of meditation.
Did you set your timer?
That begin to produce lenses that might allow us to see more deeply into the structured habits we are most often kind of entrapped in, right? In a way that resembles how trains follow tracks.
You don't think that there's a danger with that?
It's difficult for us unless we are granted an experience of liberation from the templates we tend to follow in thought, relation, and behavior. Even if we are given some liberation, right? For example, there's something unusual about the onset of romantic thoughts, feelings, and experiences. There's a feeling often described as being on top of the world. As if as if some kind of dominant position is powerful. I've never heard someone say, I was so excited I felt beneath the world. Like I was holding the world up. On top of implies
Stop. Yeah, Jordan, why don't you go hang out with that?
liberation. From obligation and subjugation,
The one you just showed me?
to be subject to the world. Psychologists and people like his name escapes me. It's where we get the idea of the hero's journey from, modernly. Perhaps his name will arise in my mind. Many of these people will tell us that such ecstatic and perhaps limerence-laden emotions, are the result of evolutionary processes, the necessity of reproduction, physical reproduction, and so forth. And the man I was thinking of, sometimes it's, we imagine that it's only good to successfully remember. It's not good to not remember. But not being able to remember actually conveys other possibilities. It creates a different array of potentials in consciousness. And this is part of what I mean by metacognition. I remember him saying on stage one night, in a lecture about the hero's journey, he sort of poo-pooed the whole romantic situation, claiming that once you see into its structure and function, you'll retreat from that, naturally retreat. Into what? I guess, more or less platonic relationships. And I can understand the perspective. I can see all the trouble of romance, but I don't think it's merely the flush of neurotransmitters and the transition of them. Doubt it. That's probably involved. I'm not saying that's not going on, but it isn't just that that's going on. And my point was that in the early days of romantic excitement, enthusiasm, there's a feeling of freedom often, and empowerment, of liberation, of together we will rise above all obstacles, we will carry each other to the sky, we will, all of these things. And I don't think those feelings are merely constructs or merely the result of chemical changes and so forth. I don't think so. Closely linked with them, perhaps. Correlated with, yes. Causal, not sure. I think something else is also going on. It's a kind of reunion where the two lineages of those lovers are getting together in a superposition above the singular identity of the lovers.
As a couple.
And they're having a kind of a grand reunion. They're having something like a relational orgasm. Vast lineages of animal progenitors, insect progenitors, living place progenitors, human progenitors, non-corporeal progenitors. They are recognizing one another through the localization of the individual humans that are falling in love or have become overwhelmed by adoration, mutual adoration. Very complex situation going on there, certainly not limited to neurotransmitters and the ephemeral joy of rubbing flowers together. Now, of course, people who are more less relationship oriented and more sex oriented, there's still a backdrop of those meta to our theories features. It turns out that the nature of human love relationships is itself a meta topic with many, complex branches that we could explore. We can explore. They're available. We have access to them should we decide that terrain is fascinating or compelling for some reason. And pretty easy to see why it's compelling. We would not be here if that weren't happening. Our parents would not have generated us. The branch of the tree of knowledge we call religion is very peculiar. And poses itself in a very strange way, a way that resembles the pose of science and the pose of mathematics, or the poses of science and mathematics. It poses itself as the super topic. Doesn't matter what the ways of knowing are. Obey God, it's all taken care of. Obey the scripture, obey the rules, obey the principles, obey the language, obey the songs. And there's no way of knowing that means anything in comparison to this. Not science, not math, not religion, outside of ours, not philosophy, not nothing. From, some perspectives on the topic, not all of them. It poses as a super topic, and science has inherited that pose, even though the word science is not actually connected to pardon me, ma'am. It's okay. In fact, the word science is very confusing when left undefined. Let's see what I can make of it. The branches of the tree of human knowledge that pose themselves on as reliable and dependable in a way other branches are not, based on their relationship with what we call data or information, based on what we would think of as empirical standards of truth testing. Right? So you can't, in science, for example, we imagine anyway, that you can't get away with making shit up. Because your data, anyone can mine that data themselves, and anyone or any group of humans can use the data to support or to attack what we call hypotheses. Now let's be really clear about what hypo means, right? Because the position of both religious thought and science is that of a hyperthesis, right? A thesis that encompasses all possible theses. So when we say the word science, we're referring to a way of knowing that poses as a hyperthesis. Hypo means less than. Hyper means inflated, inflamed, bigger than, too much. Testing. Okay. Took a little break there. In modern Western thought, apparently, at least according to Owen Barfield, who I think probably knows something about what he was writing about. He talks about a problem that arose around the time of Galileo, where previously hypotheses, lesser theses, were understood to be perspectival prostheses, valued not primarily for their truthful depiction of situations, transformations, identities, qualities, sequences, and so forth, but rather for the insight one could gain by entertaining them in consciousness. What Galileo did was to collapse that and begin, in a sense, the reign of scientific authority resulting from a hypothesis which, at least superficially, appeared equivalent to the facts, right? Captures and displays the facts. It was this feature of Galileo's work that troubled the church. And it troubled the church because it was an assault on their hyper-theory, right? And not just their hyper-theory, but their self-authorization, right? Their auto-authority, autocratic authority, over not merely the facts, but what what is the authoritative perspective and the protective concern with the conservation of authorization in systems of human thought, in social systems, in political systems, in military systems, right? All of these authorizations are held beneath the flag of the Catholic Church and other churches in other places. So it appears that it was this that aroused the ire and surveillance and damnation that descended on Galileo. Not so much, which is what we usually hear, that the idea that the planets orbit each other or orbit the sun, I meant not that idea. That idea, it was perhaps modestly radical in its assertion at that time, but had been asserted long before that by people like Copernicus and others, vastly predating Galileo and probably radically predating Copernicus. So the problem is here that the church could prophetically see, in a sense, a future in which the hyperthesis would be transferred from religion to this new thing, this sort of new thing, new version of an old thing called science. Now, if you go to the remnants of older indigenous traditions, perhaps ancient indigenous traditions, you will find that they have something that vaguely resembles science in some aspects of its inaction, embodiment, history, tradition, and so forth. And there are different kinds of resemblance. Right? There's a resemblance in which something kind of like empirical observation ensues. But there's sciences. There's also another aspect which is more or less relational and participatory. And this aspect becomes often alive and transmitted generation to generation in what we in the West refer to as ceremony and or ritual. I assure you that whatever the heck the indigenous people were actually doing prior to their encounters with the strangely abstract representational nonsense and also projection of hyper-theoretical authority, whatever they were doing before all of that, our language is poorly, English is very poorly endowed to describe or reveal that to us. I don't trust these words, ceremony or ritual, to encompass what some may claim they refer to in indigenous cultures. But they also had hypertheories. And perhaps the word in English that comes closest, or is at least starts out somewhat close to descriptive capacity, is tradition. But even this word means something very different in English, I think. The word religion fails. The word tradition fails. The word ceremony, perhaps a little closer in some ways, but fails. The word ritual, close in some ways, but fails. The phrase way of life gets closer. Or way of relation, way of staying in relation, with relation, closer. I think Barfield, in his book, Saving the Appearances, which I recommend you all read. Every one of you should read this book. You should read it 6 times, or read it, memorize the damn thing. He might call it participation. Now, what I was thinking of earlier, because I style myself under the rubric cognitive activist in some branches of my strange little brain or mind, what I was thinking of earlier were topics that were meta or progenerative of other topics, right? There are topics inside human cognition, underneath the tree of knowledge, before the branches, that are very profound. It's reasonably clear that other organisms experience something resembling self-awareness. This doesn't mean that there are 2 of them like there are in humans, as evinced by the letter W in our alphabet, right? Which begins 6 of the 7 question words, primary question words. As if we have to make a duplicate of ourselves, and only then can we begin resolving the strange problem produced by that first move, as evinced in questions such as which came first, the chicken or the egg, or what is the sound of one hand clapping, and so forth. this cognitive doubling, this capacity to imagine that there are two of me, one of which has a question and another of which poses responses to it and so forth. Very, very peculiar problem. But when I began this recording, it's actually true that I cannot remember the original motivation. And it almost doesn't matter because that original motivation was like the first stage of a rocket, right? It gets altitude and then it no longer is important. It contributes. And we tend to think, and it's not unreasonable to think, that a higher position gives you better, a new perspective. There are stories of indigenous populations in Africa, for example, that lived in a valley. I remember a story about an indigenous population who lived in a valley. And when white people, colonizing European people showed up there, they asked the men, are you aware that you live in a valley? They didn't know what a valley was. And when they were taken up the sides of mountains they'd long been familiar with, which I think, had been associated with the gods and death and so forth, the men were abjectly terrified of what they saw from up there. And did not venture for quite some time, refused to venture out of the valley. Now, this is an anecdotal story. I suspect that I'm remembering it from, I suspect that the source is likely to be Edmund Carpenter, a brilliant anthropologist. Working primarily, I think, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And by the way, if you can get a hold of any of Edmund's stuff in writing, by all means, do so. Books such as They Became What They Beheld. Can I remember any of his other titles? There's I don't even know what to say, actually. There is a family walking here that is very unusual and profound, but I can't really think of a reasonable way to characterize what renders them thus. I'm stumped. The father is leading the charge. He has a black velvet coat and a hat such as a practitioner of a practitioner of certain spiritual arts from Africa might wear. Okay, so religion poses as a hypertopic. Notice that philosophy poses as a hypertopic because philosophy examines how we think about, evaluate, value, or dismiss ways of knowing, ideas, thoughts, all these things. So there are branches on the tree that lead to hypertopics both sort of down the tree, sort of thinking not necessarily outside or inside the box, thinking about how boxes arise in the first place. Right? And then above the tree, right, they give us a superposition over all the branches. And science as a way of knowing has inherited or appropriated, in a way, the authorizations that might ordinarily and had certainly previously in relatively modern history belonged to religion. Of course, in many cultures, there were things like kings, queens, and chiefs, though the latter word is different than the first two. There's a difference between, for example, being seen as the incarnate soul of a people, a village, a tribe. There is a difference between that and the idea of one who dictates to others, right? And long associated with kings and queens is this principle of measurement, which turns out to be bizarrely important in physics and science and math, right? Notice that over time, the science developed the concept of accurate measurement was transferred from religious or monarchic authorities to a putative or nominal discipline called science. Now, in modernity, in our experience as moderns, the word science has many, many senses. On hearing the rhythmic linguism of a rap artist such as Aesop Rocks, one might declare this man is putting down some science. And strangely, the way that idea gets into popular exchange relates to the authorization to speak about hypertopics. I was listening to a song yesterday evening that was sort of rapish metal. I wonder if I could remember any parts of it. It was para-prophetic about apocalypses. Tidal waves were spreading from the US to the UK. This was all rendered in rap syllabalisms. And it was fabulous. It was really there was an image of Poseidon riding waves, trident in hand. There were all these profoundly evocative sequences of words and fricative cascades, right? Cascades of sharp endings of words, each one somehow producing like an exhortative enthusiasm. It's funny, I'm not able to remember the lyrics. It's a song I've only heard a few times, though I really like it. I've listened to very little rap. I mostly find it offensive to my musical sensibilities and my poetic sensibilities, though there are exceptions. For a long time now, the thoroughfare I'm walking on has been closed to vehicular traffic, reclaimed by pedestrians, which I think is wonderful. It's a major thoroughfare in Golden Gate Park. And obviously, if I had my way, all roads would be closed to traffic. Or there would be very few roads on which traffic was common. Which I guess people would say, well, no one would be able to get anywhere. Yeah, we'd probably be better off at this point in history, for sure. Hypertopics. So it turns out that there was a fascination with hypertopics long ago. Clearly, Socrates, in his concerns with Maeutics, the midwifery of insight and anamnesis, and also his concerns with philosophy and not just dialectics, but there's another word that means a mutual conversational inquiry. The gods and their nature were hypertopics, and I think for saying something that resembles, even the gods are not free to dictate the true and the untrue. They are subject to, they cannot change truth. And this is what was selected to charge him with impiety. For which he was executed, though they did offer him the option of amputating his most precious relationships and suffering exile rather than death. There are features of mathematics that surely comprise hypertopics, and the entire subject of geometry is one of them. Plato was aware of this. There were religions that arose, or rather conspiratorial societies that arose, or that orbited the enlightened study of geometry. And what I mean by enlightened is that it was not merely an abstract study, it was a study of the relationship.
So
between origin, the origins of minds themselves, certain features of math, and certain features of geometry. There were mystery schools and so on. As I've mentioned many times before, in human thought, in human society, in human history, for as long as we've been subject to, affected by, and productive of language, spoken language, we necessarily inherit a structural situation
Look at that.
It turns out that, and there must, in linguistics, some of this must be known. There must be nomenclature for this, but as someone who studied topics that may emerge from semantics and linguistics and psycholinguistics, it eventually became profoundly obvious to me that there's a strange and powerful structure that underlies language and thus must also underlie religion and science and hypertopics themselves. And what I'm going to speak about next is a hypertopic because it gives us a glimpse into foundational principles that underlie the possibility of conceptual thought, and particularly our lexicons. And in the lexicons, the lexicon being the library of words and forms of speech, natural to some given system. For example, modern English. So there's a structural feature of our lexicons that also has fundamentally to do with categories, not just the word lists, right? Not just the dictionaries. And I've spoken of this many times previously, but there's a structure that resembles the structure of knowledge. The hypertopics are what I would call uniphores. A couple of examples of uniphores, right? So, if words are the branches of the tree of a language, the dictionary would comprise the trunk. And so the dictionary is hyper to any word. The lexicon is hyper to any instance of language. And language is hypo to the lexicon. Similarly, there are conceptual foundations that are not ordinarily acknowledged by common speakers, and there may be words there may be words for these that I don't know. And if any of you know the words for these things that I will describe, please enlighten me. I would very much like to know. And rather than presuming that I have original knowledge, I'm much more inclined at this point to think that I may have discovered something previously well known to experts in grammar and linguistics. But there are concepts that are primordial. They are root concepts in language, and without them we would not be able to derive identity conceptually or representationally. These words I call holophores. They are words like, they are actually not the words, they are the concepts pointed at by words like friend, food, mother, mirror, dream, sky. Like all of these, you have to kind of know what the world is. You have to have some sort of world concept. Before prior to the possibility of making meaningful linguistic constructs. So, for example, language is a holophore. You have to know something about why would anyone make face noises like this, and what the face noises are intended to do, and so forth. So there are what is the world? What is a friend? What is food? What is mother? What is safety? What is threat? What is danger? All these things. So there are many holophores, and in a way, there's no canonical list. But the most important things about being human are holophores, and each language transmits an often dangerous, at least in English, it's very dangerous, misunderstanding or mispresentation of the holophores. Older languages such as Arabic and Hebrew and Sanskrit, Aramaic, perhaps certain African languages or indigenous languages, they are much, much more intelligent about how they encode holophores. And then there are uniphores, right, which are the actual supertopics, the universe, God. These are two common uniphores. The word everything, the word everyone. These point at uniphoric elements that are necessary to the structure of conceptual thought. There must be concepts in linguistics that match these that aren't. These are neologisms I invented when suddenly the structure of conceptual thought was available to the structure of language and conceptual thought was available to my awareness. And I forged these words to point at features that I was aware of, that I could see from outside language itself. And what we're speaking of here is a hypertopic because it is both within and beyond conceptual, ordinary conceptual perspective. So what I was concerned about when I began this recording, what I was interested in, was exploring the before of branches on the tree of knowledge. Ways of knowing that precede the differentiation. It's funny to precede. It made me think of the first sprout from the seed of a tree. Which seems to, if we could watch a time lapse, dig downward, while at the same time pushing its opposing feature skyward toward the light. Very profound, this thing. The root grows down into darkness, moisture, soil, thereby pressing the opposing aspect upwards into the atmosphere, and where there is day and night. This figure is a hypertopic and points at the power of metaphor in language and thought, conceptual thought, to illuminate that which declarative thought almost never is capable of approaching. Declarative language, analytical language, though analytical language can also reveal to us the structure of metaphor. Right? Very difficult to make metaphors about the structure of metaphor. We might want a deconstructive, brilliantly analytical perspective to help us to see. It's really useful to have both, right? You need the figurative, metaphoric intelligence, and you need the deconstructive, analytical intelligence, like two wings on a bird. In a sense, for spoken and written language, there is a metatopic that most of us have not been trained in, that is very important to acquire training in if one wishes to communicate profoundly and effectively, even as a even as an author of fictions. And it's the topic of rhetoric. Which is the lexicon of what we would think of as figures of speech, which could be understood from a non-linguistic perspective as the shapes of structure in language, right? Almost like the puzzle shape, the different kinds of puzzle shapes you can produce and how they fit together. The anatomy of not so much words, but sequences, chunks of words. There were times, and it may still be true in history, where rhetoric was taught to children institutionally, but primarily it was taught to the children of the elite and rarely taught to the children of the poor, unless their parents, having been thus educated, transmitted this knowledge to them. I'm getting ready to wind up the recording here, but before I do, I'm going to mention a book that has become a sort of mimetic success recently, and I'm not yet sure what I think of it, but I find some of the concepts within it enlightening and inspiring. And it's a book called The Dawn of Everything. One of the authors is David Graeber. The other author is also David, but I cannot recall his last name. And in the beginning of the book, they assert that much of what we've been told about the human nature by modern historians, and some, modern being like 500 years, something like this, is wrong. And one of the things they said, they included a quote from, I think it was Benjamin Franklin, that I will paraphrase here. The Indian people, when we adopt them into our society and grant them, the status of citizens and so forth, presuming that ever happened, maybe that statement isn't included. But we provisionally grant them some status in our culture. At the first opportunity where they are allowed to interact with their people again, and particularly should they engage in ceremony, they will not return to our society. Almost invariably, none of them will return. And he mentions that at the same time, people from our society who have been captured by the Indians and have joined their society will generally refuse to return to ours, no matter what boons or benefits, even if there's an estate worth $1 million awaiting them back in who knows where, Philadelphia. They will not return. And it is claimed that the primary reason, which should be obvious, is that our roles and identities in society, in civilization, civil society are phony. They're fake, they're costumes, they're counterfeits of our humanity that we must constantly keep up this appearance of, to our great impoverishment, relationally, socially, developmentally. You know, in our society, people die inside themselves of loneliness in open view of thousands of other people. The interior poverty of our modern civilizations is exceeded only by the appearance of external wealth. In a conversation with a friend last night, I wrote an essay called The Factories of Emptiness, Death in a Fictional Nation, which you can find on my Medium page if you care to peruse it. There's some fucking function, there's some disease in our society which is fundamentally extractive in its relation to our interiority and ends up killing people who are famous, right? Jimi Hendrix, Judy Garland, lots and lots of people, just two examples. Doesn't kill everyone outright. And some people survive the exporting of their interiority into public view that results in fame, but many, many don't. It's obvious that what is extractively propagated in public view, influencers and so on, often represents the death or the falsification of our humanity, our creativity, what should actually be influential, right? That dies stillborn in the swarming mass of media objects and photographs and representations of excellence that never there existed. In our time, anyone who can fake excellence well enough or produce it within the confines of the market system that builds sports heroes and fashion heroes and so forth. A great big white dog just running into the field, and it's almost as if a snowstorm had legs. It's really great to watch it, or a cloud. It's awesome. I was struck very deeply by this concept that I'm here elucidating when I was reading the beginnings of their book the other night, and I will surely have more to say about it. But for now, I want to thank you all for joining me. Please like, comment, or share this recording or any of my recordings if you find them valuable. Strangely, I too must compete in the bizarre market produced by the internet, YouTube, Facebook, and so on. If I am to gain the opportunities to enact the principles that I speak of, in my recordings. So in any way that you might feel inclined to support my work, I am very grateful for that support, even if it is merely your listening. So thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning together again very soon, and I wish you amazing dreams, wonderful relationships, and a beautiful way of life. Bye-bye for now.